In 1968, a boy in Newcastle was found dead on a patch of wasteland. The police assumed it was an accident. It wasn't. The person who killed him wasn't a stranger, wasn't an adult, wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows. She was 11 years old. She lived 3 streets away. And what she did next is why, to this day, the world still isn't allowed to know her real name. This is the case of Mary Bell. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how an 11-year-old committed 2 murders in one summer and why, more than 50 years later, her identity is still protected by law. But to understand what happened, you have to understand the girl, and the childhood almost no one talks about. Mary Flora Bell was born in 1957 in Scotswood, a poor, industrial, half-demolished corner of Newcastle upon Tyne. Rubble everywhere. Empty houses kids used as playgrounds. The kind of place where nobody was really watching the children too closely. Her mother was Betty. Betty had Mary as a teenager, and by most accounts, never wanted her. There are reports, some disputed, some confirmed later in psychiatric and journalistic accounts, of Mary being physically abused and exposed to things a small child should never be exposed to. There were also reports Betty struggled in ways that left Mary badly cared for, and on at least one occasion may have tried to give her away. None of that excuses what came next. Nothing does. But if you're trying to understand how an 11-year-old becomes capable of taking a life, twice, this is where you have to start looking. Because here's what the people around Mary noticed, and mostly dismissed. She'd already shown a pattern. Before the killings that made her infamous, she'd reportedly strangled other children, and those children survived, unreported, unpunished, because the victims were young enough, and the incidents were written off as rough play. One boy was pushed from the roof of an air raid shelter and seriously hurt. It was treated as an accident. Warning signs were there. Almost nobody connected them. Which brings us to the summer that changed everything. On May 25, 1968, 4-year-old Martin Brown was found dead inside an abandoned house in Scotswood. There were no obvious marks of violence, no clear cause of death. The initial ruling, accidental. 2 days later, someone broke into a local nursery school. Toys were destroyed, and on a piece of paper, left almost like a taunt, was a note claiming responsibility for Martin's death. Police at the time wrote it off as a cruel prank. Then, on July 31st, 3-year-old Brian Howe disappeared. His body was found the next day on a patch of wasteland not far from where Martin had died. This time, there was no mistaking it. This was a killing. We're not going to walk through every detail of what was done to Brian's body. It doesn't serve the story, and it doesn't honor him. What matters is this. The injuries were disturbing enough that investigators knew immediately they weren't looking for an adult predator in the traditional sense. They were looking for someone who didn't understand, or didn't care, how to hide a crime. And the whole time, a local girl kept turning up at the edges of the investigation, offering to help search for Brian, talking to reporters, asking, unprompted, to see his body in the coffin. What made this case even stranger was how she was caught. Mary Bell wasn't caught by forensic evidence. She was caught by her own behavior. She knew details about Brian's death that had never been released to the public. She kept inserting herself into the investigation in ways that, to police, started to look less like a curious child and more like someone who couldn't resist being close to what she'd done. Her friend, 13-year-old Norma Bell, no relation, was present for at least one of the killings. Under police questioning, Norma's account of events began to shift, and eventually, she implicated Mary directly, describing what she said she'd witnessed. This is where juvenile cases diverge sharply from adult ones. Children this young can't simply be interrogated like adult suspects. There are protections. There's supposed to be extra care in how they're questioned, because the reliability of a child's statement and a child's understanding of what they're even confessing to is a different legal and psychological question entirely. That tension, how do you extract the truth from an 11 and a 13-year-old without contaminating it, became central to how this case was built. By August, both girls were charged with 2 counts of manslaughter, and that charge, manslaughter and not murder, was about to open up one of the most debated legal questions of the entire case. The trial opened in December 1968 at Newcastle Assizes. It ran for 9 days, and because the defendants were children, the court itself was rearranged. No dock, the girls seated close to their lawyers and their families, an attempt to make an adult courtroom slightly less terrifying for 2 children. But make no mistake, this was an adult court, trying children for one of the darkest crimes imaginable. Court-appointed psychiatrists testified that Mary displayed what they described as classic symptoms of psychopathy for someone her age. The defense's argument wasn't that she hadn't done it. It was that she couldn't be held fully responsible for it, that her mental state meant this wasn't murder in the legal sense. Norma Bell was acquitted entirely. Mary Bell was convicted, not of murder, but of manslaughter, on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The judge, Mr. Justice Cusack, didn't treat this as a technicality. He was blunt. He said she posed a very grave risk to other children, and he sentenced her to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, a term that functionally meant she could be held indefinitely, for as long as authorities deemed necessary. Here's the question this case forced Britain to sit with, and one that's never fully gone away. Can an 11-year-old truly be culpable, in the way we mean that word for adults? Is diminished responsibility the right frame, or does labeling a child's actions as something less than murder let a system look away from how disturbing the reality actually is? Different countries and different eras have answered this differently. It's still being answered today, every time a country debates the age of criminal responsibility. What happened to Mary after the verdict is, in some ways, the part of this story people know the least about. Mary Bell spent the next 12 years in a series of secure institutions, first for young offenders, later transferred as she got older. In 1980, at 23, she was released on license, having spent almost exactly half her life in detention. And that's when the second, quieter part of this story begins. On release, Mary was granted anonymity, a legal order shielding her identity, to protect her from vigilantes and from a public that, understandably, hadn't forgotten. That order didn't expire. It didn't sunset after some fixed number of years. It was later extended, and extended again, to protect not just her, but her own child, for life. Which means somewhere in Britain right now, there is a woman, a grandmother by most accounts, who has spent more than 4 decades under a name that isn't the one she was born with, protected by a court order specifically written so that this story could never fully catch up to her again. She's a grandmother now, living somewhere in Britain under a name the courts will protect until she dies. Which leaves one question we still can't answer. Was she born capable of this, or was she made? If Mary Bell makes you think it was her childhood that made her, hold that thought, because the next case I want to show you is the opposite. A boy from a stable, loving home, no abuse, no neglect, who still did something almost identical. Watch that one next, and see if you still believe the answer is that simple.